All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome back to another week of Past to Present 2026. My name is Julia. I work in the education department here at Columbia River Maritime Museum. If you could please take a moment to silence your cell phones before we get started, I would appreciate that. You'll notice we have our captions up and running again. That's very exciting, everyone. Last week we were having some technical difficulties, but we do have auto captions again this week. That being said, we were kind of doing some troubleshooting with the volume on some of these videos in the presentation. So just bear with us if we have to mess around with it a little bit. We are welcoming two lovely folks from the Vanport Mosaic this morning. Lo Forti is the co-founder and director of Vanport Mosaic. Since 2014, she has led the organization's oral history projects, curated exhibits, and public programming. Laura is a multimedia journalist, cultural organizer, and a story midwife, supporting communities and defining how their stories should be told and shared. Her approach to community engagement and ethical storytelling has been featured at the Tribeca Film Festival, in Collaborating for a Cause on Media That Matters, and at restorative narrative conferences. LaVeta Gilmore Jones, a proud Vanport descendant, is the daughter of former Vanport resident Beatrice Leola Cannon Gilmore and Reverend Rozell Gilmore, both now with the ancestors. LaVeta produces the annual Vanport Reunion and coordinates additional gatherings for Vanport residents and their descendants. She also serves as a public speaker with Vanport Mosaic, sharing stories that honor the community's history and legacy, and is a Vanport Mosaic board member. Born and raised in Portland, Oregon, LaVeta spent her career as a public school educator and later as an executive director and community organizer for a local nonprofit. She finds deep joy in celebrating life with her children, grandchildren, extended family, and friends. Please welcome Laura and LaVeta.
Good morning, everyone. I had the joy to chat already with some of you. I'm Laura. I'm the co-founder and director. And maybe you caught my title that, of course, I self-appointed. I'm a story midwife. And this is because in my practice as a storyteller and a journalist, I made a commitment to serve the community, to be the person or the channel who support the labor of telling the story. So unlike a typical extractive practice, all my projects, even before the Vanport Mosaic, have been in collaborations with communities. So I'm not the one telling the story, I'm the one who shares the tools and support the sometimes painful labor of telling our stories. So I started, the Vanport Mosaic started as an oral history project to record the history, the memories, the first-person memories of those who lived in Vanport, who survived the flood, and have memories also of the aftermath. When we talk about Vanport, usually we think about the flood, but this project has expanded way beyond that. So today we are a platform for memory activism. We amplify, honor, and preserve the silenced histories of our region. And we do so to really understand our present and to imagine a new chapter where we all belong and thrive. So it's a multidisciplinary collective of artists, historians, docents, students, and of course, at the center of everything, there is the Vanport community. So we've been honored to receive the gift of their stories for the past 10 years. We turned 10 a few months ago. And the oral history project is ongoing. So I was excited to hear that many of you have connections. We also have an archive. Soon will be actually, you are going to be able to access 10 years of collective research, and we have a lot of beautiful material like the ones that you brought today for us. And I want to tell you that throughout the present, LaVeta will tell you the story. She's an incredible presenter. But you will see a few clips, a few moments of some of the oral histories. So know that those are just a glimpse into our living archive. And also they were produced, but not by professional producers. Again, remember I said that my practice is collaborative. So these stories have been collected and produced by everyone. You could do that too with us. And so, you know, they're pretty raw in a way, but they've been a collective labor of love. So with that said, we can talk about more about what we do. And I want to invite you to some of the upcoming events, but we can talk about that later. I would love to introduce you my friend, mentor, and everything, LaVeta Gilmore Jones. What do I use to?
Another little
Is this the one that I?
No. Hello. I am so glad to be here with all of you here in Astoria. You know, I didn't honestly know that Astoria had a maritime museum until we were invited here today. So this is really a treat to just be here with all of you today. I'm going to tell you this a story, just frame a story of Vanport and the city that it is, as Laura said, through the oral histories of people and also through some of the stories that were told to me. And I would start this story with my grandfather, Ural Cannon, was born in 1910, and he was born in Louisiana, in Mississippi, and then migrated to Louisiana. And so he and his brothers worked in a sawmill down in Louisiana, and the war broke out. And when it broke out, they heard that there was better wage-paying jobs in Henderson, Nevada, if you worked in the mines. And so he and his brothers left Louisiana by night, drove to Henderson, Nevada, and then they worked there until that work ended. And then they heard about this work up in Oregon. Now, imagine what it's like for someone who has grown up, lived in Mississippi and Louisiana, and going all the way across country to a place that is totally foreign. But he packed the family, my grandmother, my mom, my aunt, my uncle, and they got in the car. They drove to Vanport, to Oregon. And when they got to Oregon, they found that there was indeed work available for people in the shipyards. And so I'm going to kind of intersperse his story a little bit into this story that we're telling today. And but I want to start it with Vanport wouldn't have existed if World War II hadn't started. And I'm kind of curious, you know, on December the 7th, the Empire of Japan executed a military strike on the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. That happened on December the 7th, 1941. And I'm curious, how many of you were living when that happened? That's what I figured. I figured we'd have some World War II folks in the audience. That was such a stunning strike. And when Laura and I were talking last night, the people who died in that strike, almost with the American lives that were lost and some of the Japanese lives that were lost, it almost came to the total of what we experienced in 9/11. And so when we stop and think that almost 3,000 lives were lost in that strike and the impact that it had on the country, and we think about what happened when 9/11 happened and the impact that that had, kind of sit with that a minute. So when that happened, then we have the need to enter the war. And so I'm going to beg your, whatever it is, your permission, because I'm 72 years old and I have to use notes, okay? And so, anyhow, when America entered the war on December the 8th, 1941. We declared war on Japan. And then on December the 11th, 1941, Germany and Italy declared war on the United States, and the United States declared war on Germany and Italy. And that was our entry into World War II. Now, to enter a war, what do you need? Especially if it's overseas. Ships. We need ships. And we had a sizable number of ships that were destroyed in the Pacific Fleet. And so it was time to, rally together and build some ships. And so a man named Henry Kaiser and his son and people that he knew, they decided to form the Oregon Shipbuilding Corporation, and they built 3 shipyards in the Pacific Northwest. One was in Vancouver, Washington, and then the other 2 were in Oregon, in Portland. And they came up with a unique way to build ships because on the average, it took about over 200 days to build one ship. So they came up with an assembly line process for building ships and they were able to get ships built between 42 and 45 days. 42 to 45 days from start to finish. And more than 700 vessels were launched from the shipyards in the Pacific Northwest. Do we even hear that? We were responsible. The laborers who worked in the shipyards were responsible for supplying the war effort with 700 ships. That's something to keep in our cap, a feather in our cap, something to remember. There were Liberty ships, Victory ships, export carriers, military tankers, and landing ships. Those were the kind of ships that were built in that shipyard. Now, the next thing that we know is that ships were being built. So then what do you need when ships are being built? Well, you need people to build the ships, right? And so because there was a need to build the ships, Kaiser put out a call. He's like, okay, folks, we need to build some ships. So, what can we do? We're going to need also housing for these shipbuilders. So there is now a situation where we have ships that need to be built and we have workers who need to build the ships. So we're going to go into an oral story right now of Becky Kaiser, the daughter of Henry Kaiser. And she's going to tell us what it was like being part of that shipbuilding effort during World War II.
Okay, so I apologize. This is entirely my fault, not LaVeta's, not the museum's friends. So we had 2 decks, one with the slides and the stories, and one without the stories. So why don't we do this? Maybe you and I figure it out.
And I'll keep telling the story.
Right. She knows a lot of stories, so I know you'll be fine. Me, on the other hand.
We are going to hear these oral stories, folks. but I will give you a little more framework about the stories. Okay? So anyhow, let's see what we got here. So we knew that we need to have ships built. And so Henry Kaiser got some money from, just a minute here, let's get this pulled up here. He secured funds from the U.S. Maritime Commission, and he purchased land, 650 acres of swampy land on the Columbia Slough between Portland and Vancouver to develop the housing project. And this housing project, first this land was, the land was drained and it was filled and prepped for construction. And then it was surrounded, though, by dikes on 3 sides because it was 15 to 20 feet below river level. But that's where he had to, he wanted the land to be located in a place where it was close to Swan Island, St. John's, and Vancouver, and where it would be convenient for workers, and where there was access to railroad yards so that they could get supplies in to build the ships and also supplies for feeding the people and housing people. And so there was also another reason why that land in the Columbia Slough was picked, because Portland was not ready to receive an influx of workers from 48 states across the nation. They were not ready. Portland didn't even have a housing bureau. And so Portland was also a very segregated city. It did not have a large population of people of color, African American, Native American, Latino. It didn't have a large population of people. It was a primarily white city. And so the people who did live in Portland only kind of lived in a small area. And so this land was selected, and building began on May of 1942. And in less than 110 days, the project was completed. It was not meant to be a permanent housing project. It was just meant to be temporary. However, if you look at the slide, you see that there were 710 buildings, 10,000 plus apartment units, and at its peak, over 40,000 residents lived in Vanport. It turned out to be Oregon's second largest city during the wartime. And it wasn't a city in that it didn't have its own governance. It was governed by the Housing Bureau, but it had everything that a city needed. It had library. It had a police department. It had an infirmary. It had stores. It had schools and nurseries and daycares. It had everything that was needed for people who were living in that city to thrive and survive. So with that in mind, you can see what it looked like. I'll give you a chance just to look at that slide. You had roads, nursery schools, a theater. It was surrounded by dikes on 3 sides because it was 15 feet below sea level, and a railroad berm on the west side, a railroad embankment on the west side. There was a cafeteria where everyone could eat. There was a park. And my mom and her brother and sister loved going to the movie. There was a movie theater. And the interesting thing about Vanport was that the Housing Bureau decided that the housing needed to be segregated. That was the law of the land. And so they did have segregated housing. At least it started out that way until it got to the point where there were so many people coming in that they couldn't keep it that way. But it did start out with segregated housing. The superintendent of the school was told to make the schools segregated also. And he said, no, refused to do it. And we're ready? Okay. And so he refused to make the schools segregated. And so the kids all went to school together. They played together. They had dirt clod fights. They had their own little territory. But in the end, it was an opportunity for people to have to interact with folks that they may not have had to interact with before. I remember my aunt telling me that she was playing basketball and she accidentally fouled the girl next to her who was white. And she was terrified because she had touched this girl. And her instructor came over and said, it's okay. It's all right. This is how you play basketball. And then she went ahead and played. But still, you know, we have people coming in from all different places with all different mindsets. And so this was a new experience. This was like an experiment, really, when you think about it. So let's see if we can get an oral history story here now.
You get a peek behind the curtain. You can see what everyone's sending me. Why is that?
Verify it's you.
Nope. Oh, it's thinking about it.
I know, they were so much easier, weren't they?
So give it a second.
Okay. Now, a little note that we found is that the war effort, the slogan was, we have Rosie the Riveter, right? But in Astoria, who knows what Astoria's claim to fame was? Anyone know? Yeah, we did. But the slogan was, Portland had Rosie the Riveter, and Astoria had the Daughters of Columbia. The Daughters of Columbia. Thank you, that is what Astoria had. Okay, and I don't know, what are we doing? Oh, is that all we're doing? Okay, I'm not gonna worry about it then. Okay, well, I will keep telling the story, okay? And you all are gonna hear all of, and so the oral histories will give you, they will fill out the framework that I'm sharing with you now, okay? So anyhow, we had all these people living in Vanport. building, and Vanport was a 24-hour city. 3 days, and yeah, it was a 24-hour city. And after the war, some people stayed. About 18,000 people did leave, but that still left a sizable population in Vanport. And it was, and of that population of about 18 to 20,000 people who stayed, about 6,500 were African American. And one of those was my granddad, was my family, my grandparents, my mom, aunt, and uncle. Why did they stay? Any ideas as to why they stayed? Well, I can tell you why. He was making good money. He was working in the shipyards. He was making a living wage as opposed to eking out a wage, and opportunity. In 1946, he says, I got my first union card. Now, can you imagine organizing a union in Louisiana and Mississippi during the 1940s? Not happening. He was so proud to have that union card, and he was so proud to be able to make a living for his family, to be able to buy a house on contract so that his family had a decent place to live. And, okay, I will, okay. And he was so moved by what the opportunity provided that he became an active member in his union. For 12 years, he served as the assistant to the general manager, to the general business manager. But then he got a little taste of, we can do more. And so then he decided to serve on the executive board, and he served on that for 25 years. But then he also decided, I can run for office. And so he served as the president of the Laborers International Union, Local 296, for 22 years. 22 years. That is something that would not have ever happened if he'd stayed in Louisiana. But it is something that happened because he came here and worked in the Kaiser shipyards. What an opportunity that provided for him. And think about all of the other stories of people who worked in those shipyards and stayed and went on to make a good living, economic living for their family, but also community with their families. Okay, which one are we doing? Okay, we'll do Ed Washington. Okay.
You send it to me? This is the one I have.
And the next voice you'll hear will be from someone who kind of looks like me, or I look like her.
Thank you, everyone, for your patience. I appreciate it. All right.
Now we have some people with us today whose families experienced the flood. Would you like to share with us?
I was 8 years old, 1948. My father, our family lived on Marine Drive. My father had a marine repair service at the Portland Yacht Club. And when the flood happened, he purchased a Navy surplus plane rearming boat that was all open. It had the steering gear and the motor and midships. And the bow was a front bow, but it was all open. He went around over to Vanport a couple days after the initial flood and started picking up pets that were hanging in trees, people's belongings that were floating. And then on the way back from Vanport through the valley there, he was towing houses back on their foundation and anchoring them. And I was shipped off to my grandma's house, as all of my siblings were. But when we came home, there was about 1.5 feet of silt in our backyard that was stinky. It was a mess. And all around the neighborhood, there was evidence of things that had floated from Vanport, like in ditches and around the yards and everything. And we found wooden legs, we found hope chests, we found all kinds of personal effects that we would pick up and bring home, and we would take them to a place where they could be redeemed. And I just remember the most, I do have some 8mm movies that he took. It was just devastating to think that there were that many people living there at that time and some of the lives that were lost. And of course, everybody's homes and belongings were lost because it happened so fast. And we were lucky because our house was on the dike on Marine Drive, and we had like 5 feet of water in our basement, but that was nothing compared to what the people lost in Vanport. And the aftermath was terrible. I just can't describe the smell and the destruction. I'm forgetful now these days, but that I'll never forget.
Thank you.
We had gone down to California to visit my relatives in Napa, and we came back on the train, and I remember the tracks on the steel bridge were covered with water, and the train had to go very slow and we had to get out of the train station, north of the train station. The next day, my father took us in his car to Vanport, and I remember seeing the water up to the second story. That's all.
Thank you. Is there anyone else who would like to share? Something that I did want to share with us is that, after the shipyards, after the war ended, there were still, 18 to 20,000 people there. And the population shifted a little bit because the soldiers who had been in the war came back and they needed housing for their families. And so Vanport had something called the Vanport Extension College. And the Vanport Extension College eventually became Portland State University. That is where it actually started, right there in Vanport. And so the veterans were able to come back, they were able to get an education. And when the flood happened, there was this determination that we will not let this die. And so they continued this Vanport Extension College and eventually it landed downtown on Lincoln Street in Portland State University. And so today, if you go into Portland, you can go to a building, and it's called the Vanport Building. And in that building, you will see a mural and a display that honors the story of Vanport. And we created it, yes. Yes, that is one of the projects that we were able to collaborate on. Something else, someone said something to me a while back. They said, you know, the Pacific Northwest was very instrumental in the war effort, and the people who came from all across the 48 states were very instrumental in building ships. Why don't we have anything there that commemorates that? Because today when people come to that area, they say, well, where was Vanport? Well, in 1957, there was a deliberate act by the City Council of Portland to erase the name of Vanport. They called and said it was an emergency declaration. They wanted to repurpose the land for commercial use. And the mayor said it was just a housing project. It was more than a housing project. It was home for so many people. But with that declaration, they said it is no longer going to be called Vanport. There will be East Delta Park and West Delta Park. And that was it. The name Vanport was erased. And today, if you go into Portland, if you go to the Delta Park Dog Park, that's where part of Vanport was built, and also the Blue Heron Golf Club. That also is land where Vanport was built. Yes.
Originally, the Portland International Raceway drove on the roads that were from Vanport. They've been modified since, but
That's correct. Yes. So anyway, what we have done is we have collaborated with a company called Upswell to create an audio walk of Vanport. And an audio walk, what Mr. Ed Washington and myself, we went to the place where Vanport had been built and where the community of Vanport was located. And we walked. And as we walked, Ed shared his stories and I asked questions. And then I remembered things that my mom said to me, and we had this wonderful conversation. And then with that conversation, this company, Upswell, now has taken our conversation and they have curated pieces from people's oral histories to create as if we were there, as if you are there. And we had a gathering of some of the elders from Vanport just last week to listen to the rough cut. And they loved it because they felt it represented their story. And so we are looking forward to releasing that audio walk to the public in May of some time at the 11th Vanport Mosaic Festival. Laura here is she's my coach. So be on the lookout for that. You can also find us if you are computer savvy and like to look things up on the computer. If you go to vanportmosaic.org, O-R-G, you can find many different things about Vanport on our website. We do have every year in Portland a festival. And this week it'll be a 1-week festival, the last week of May. And we have different activities, screenings. In the past, we've had plays, we've had music, we've had lectures from different people. Last year, Kelly Bosworth, she's a professor at Oregon State University. She did a presentation on Mrs. Woods, who was the music teacher at Vanport. So we have a lot of fun and interesting activities and events for people. So if you're up in Portland that last week, look us up. We do a lot of our events at the Historic Alberta House. And if you go to the Historic Alberta House during that week, we have a gallery where you can go and you can view pictures and you can read and see some things pertaining to Vanport. So, well, you can come whenever. Okay, Laura says you can come whenever. Just let us know. We'll make sure it's open for you so that you can come and be immersed in the story of Vanport. Excuse me.
So let's give Laura and LaVeta a round of applause.
Can I just thank you so much? This is such a wonderful place that we didn't know, and now we feel home. But I'm not going to do this to you anymore, ever again.
We have about 5 minutes for questions, so I'll have a handheld microphone for one half of the room, and then Maddie has a second handheld microphone. If you want to come up to the front, actually, Maddie. So feel free to raise your hand. We'll come over to you, and then everyone can hear your question. I'm going to start right up front here.
Hi, just had a question. What about banks? How do they get paid? I didn't see a bank in that town.
Come on up to the podium. We'll put you in the hot seat.
I don't know. So that's another area for research. Yeah.
Go ahead.
This is exactly why we are still here 10 years later, researching, working with historians, diving into the archives. It just happens like this. Someone asks a question that no one else asked before. Like, yeah, right. And then there's going to be something that was going to bring us an answer. So I always appreciate the new questions.
All right, we'll have one question on Maddie's side, then we'll bounce back over here.
One thing you didn't mention was when they first went to the federal government to get funding to build Vanport, Henry Kaiser wanted to name it Kaiserville, name it after himself. And the federal government said, no, we're going to create a name. And so it's Van for Vancouver, Port for Portland.
All right, we have a question up here.
Can you talk about when the flood occurred and people had to leave? Where did they go?
Oh. People went to churches, they went to public buildings, to schools, to Masonic halls. They went wherever they could house that many people immediately and in people's homes. And then the trailers were set up so that families could move into trailers temporarily. And one person said that people who, that summer, she said the kids hit every vacation Bible school they could go to throughout the city because that's where the parents, they needed to have a break from the kids. And so every church, Portland had a lot of churches, and they went to all the vacation Bible schools their parents could send them to. The Red Cross was instrumental in helping some people, and we've had mixed stories. We've had mixed stories about the Red Cross.
So we have a question. Charlene, did you want to say something?
I was
There
wondering,
we go.
because I brought LaVeta a report card from Vanport School, 1944-45. And I was wondering what happened to all those teachers and the principal, the report cards signed by those names. Do you have an archive that researches those families and those individuals who were in that school setting? And where did all the kids end up the next school year?
The kids ended up, those who stayed ended up in Portland Public Schools. And the teachers that were, like one of the teachers, Barbara Jordan, was one of the teachers. Martha Jordan, I'm sorry. Barbara Jordan was the politician. That's right. Martha Jordan, she had to fight to get to teach in Portland schools, but she ended up teaching at Kennedy School, which is now Kennedy McMenamins. And they have a room dedicated to her.
We just met a gentleman. His mom, he wasn't in Vanport, but his mom was a teacher, and the mother preserved everything of her time when she was teaching. So we are literally at this moment scanning this incredible material, and there are all the names of the teachers, and and then there is a beautiful letter from the superintendent to the teachers about the closing of this incredible experience that they had together. So stay tuned. There's going to be, for sure, another project coming.
All right, I'm going to go to this gentleman, and I think we have one more person with Maddie.
I need to stand up.
Yeah,
I'd stand up. You asked about the Red Cross. My mom lived in Vanport, and she lived there with her mother and her brother, who had just been released from the Army, and he was there. His memory was that he was sleeping upstairs when the flood came in, and the memory that I remember that he told us was that he was always surprised that the trees were floating by vertically, because when he woke up, he looked out the window and the trees were floating by, and he couldn't figure out how that happened, what was going on. And then, of course, he got rescued from out of there. My mom and dad were preparing for their honeymoon. They got married 3 weeks later, and all of my mom's wedding gifts had been shipped from where she came from in Illinois. My dad was from Montana, and everything had been shipped and was at the house there. They were down with my grandmother, my dad's mom, to the coast on a visit down here, coming down to the coast. They, of course, had an escort because they were young and they were not allowed to go by themselves to faraway places because you never know what's going to happen. So they were not there when they came back, when the flood happened. When they came back, the flood had happened. I've got a few pictures that they took. And you ask about the Red Cross, they were not allowed to get to their apartment. The Red Cross kept them out for about 2 weeks. And when they finally made it back into the apartment had been looted, of course. All of her wedding gifts, everything was gone. So when they got married 3 weeks later, when the old saying about something borrowed, something blue, her wedding gown had been stolen. So she was married in a borrowed wedding gown. So they end up married, and this is my brother here. And so that's our kind of little story about Vanport. But yeah, you talk about mixed reaction to the Red Cross. The Red Cross kept everybody out for 2 weeks under the pretense they were looking for bodies and stuff like that. And so by the time they got back into the apartment, which had not been damaged, everything was gone. My question is about the debris flow. So whether the apartment was looted or things were lost and floated away, how far downstream did material that was being salvaged by people in Cathlamet or St. Helens or other towns along the river, that stuff had to go someplace, and it wasn't necessarily all damaged. And I've always been curious about, okay, where did this stuff come? Did it show up on the beaches on the coast? How many people have a piece of furniture in their house that live in Cathlamet that basically they salvaged out of the river. Because as we all know about salvage rights, if nobody's name on it, it's not tagged or marked, and you see it floating down the river, it's yours. So I was always curious, has anybody ever looked? It's like, how far downstream was the debris flow from Vanport?
Yeah, I don't know how far, but we have periodically some people reaching out saying, I found this, or my house is a Vanport house because it was floating salvage. So we never been able to prove any of this, right? But an interesting aspect of the archaeology of the land, and people are still finding objects on Delta Park. And there is this lady, Terry Johnson, and she used to be the caretaker of the area. And so for years, she's been digging out the mud, and she found a lot of artifacts, like the marbles, the toys, the plates. And so we borrow a lot of her treasures when we do exhibits. And literally 2 months ago, we've been called by the agency that is doing some remediation work there, and say, we found some crap. Do you want to come and see it? And of course, I've never been so excited. And we did, there was a lot of crap for real. There was like a lot of garbage that, of course, after the years, but we did find at least 4 objects that are definitely from Vanport. So we are still, again, it's an ongoing, there's always another discovery around the corner. So that's why it's a beautiful effort. And it's not just about the story, but it's about the communities, the relationships. It's just, people think about the flood, which of course was such a tragedy. But, as a former journalist, I like to invite people to think in a broader way about communities, not just about the most awful thing that happened to them, but who they were, what they lost, and also how they survived. And that's really the Vanport story it's full of these lessons of community care, solidarity, resilience, and just people coming together and doing what we all need to do.
Loving one another.
I'm going to reach out. We would like to continue the conversation for those of you who have stories and artifacts. And I'm thinking we might come back with our public historians. So please find me, or I'll find you.
Before I set you all free, we do have one final week of our Past to Present lecture series next Tuesday, February 17th. And that's going to be with Olive Theodore. She's the founder of Walrus Boat Recycling and works on sustainable practices for repurposing derelict vessels around the Pacific Northwest. So same time, same place. Again, please feel free to come up to Laura and LaVeta to chat after. I very much appreciate all of you coming this morning, and have a great rest of your day.